Live from Barangaroo Studios, this is the Women in Banking and Finance 12th Annual Forum, hosted by Deutsche Bank.
Good evening, members and guests. On behalf of Women in Banking and Finance, I welcome you to our 12th Annual Forum, hosted by Deutsche Bank. My name is Jen Dalitz, and I'm the CEO of Women in Banking and Finance. Before we begin our exciting program tonight, may I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're all standing, wherever you may be, and tonight I'm standing on traditional land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. May I also thank our event partner and Diamond member Deutsche Bank for hosting our flagship annual forum for the 12th consecutive year. We simply couldn't do it without you, and WIBF truly enjoys the partnership we have with Deutsche Bank in presenting this much anticipated annual event. Now, although this is our 12th annual forum, it's the very first time we've live streamed the event to our members right around this beautiful country, and in some cases beyond our shores. Of course, there have been many disappointments over the course of 2020, and I send my love particularly to our members in Melbourne who are finally emerging from lockdown. But there have been some silver linings to the pandemic, and extending the reach of this important event beyond our usual Sydney audience is but one. As we approach the runway towards the year end, it would be easy to wish away the remnants of 2020. It's fair to say that as far as years go, 2020 has been a bit of a problem child. But as a teacher, 2020 has taught us a lot. It's taught us in the banking and finance sector to be patient and kind as we delivered record levels of service to our customers who needed us more than ever before. As phone lines ran hot and call centres moved into our lounge rooms and home offices, we stepped up and did what we needed to do with grace and compassion. It's taught us as a country that we have one of the strongest and most effective financial services industries in the world. The collaboration between regulators and the regulated and our treasuries has reminded us we're all part of something bigger. And it's taught us, as a community, to focus on what we can control instead of what we can't. So many times over the past 8 months, as the going got tough, I heard my late father's voice ringing in my ear. Don't worry about it, kiddo. Because I think we've all learned that worry doesn't help. Tonight, we're going to hear from 3 outstanding leaders from across our business and academic communities on what really does matter though, keeping perspective in troubled times. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce Glenn Morgan, Interim CEO of Deutsche Bank Australia, who will guide us into tonight's discussion on why a fresh perspective is, and always will be, so important.
Thank you, Jen. And on behalf of Deutsche Bank, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I realise that we're in all sorts of locations, but like Jen, I also want to acknowledge that those of us in the studio here are on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I also pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. This annual forum is a key event on our diversity calendar, one that we always look forward to and are extremely proud to host. This year, of course, there is a major difference in that we are all virtual. The good news is that that means the event is open to a much wider range of attendees across Australia, including, of course, as Jen mentioned, Victoria, who have been enduring extended lockdown. So a very special welcome to our Victorian attendees, and please know that we are thinking of you. And for the first time in the event's 12-year history, we also have international attendees. So a warm welcome to you all. The theme this year is a fresh perspective, and what timing. That couldn't be more apt. COVID has forced us to take a fresh perspective on virtually everything we do. The way we learn, the way we teach, the way we socialise, the way we sanitise, the way we shop, the way we interact with our families. And as someone with an HSC student, I can certainly relate to that. The way that we stay healthy, both mentally and physically. And of course, the way that we work. That has profoundly changed forever. One thing I do know is moving to a remote workforce was easier for companies that had already worked flexibly. At Deutsche Bank, we launched a renewed agile working program about 3 years ago. So we already had about 1 in 5 or so employees working with a formal, flexible arrangement. And we had a lot of others who were working on informal arrangements or perhaps had worked on one in the past. Within days of COVID-19 coming in, 97% of our staff were working remotely. And that was all made possible by the new rock stars of the finance industry, our technology team. So a big shout out to you. Now, of course, we're all thinking about the future of work and what it looks like for our organisation and our people. In our most recent survey taken in May, we found that 80% of our employees want to make working from home a permanent part of their working week. The future of work is particularly interesting for financial firms because the finance industry has been so culturally centred around the office, but then we just proved that nobody has to physically be there to make things happen. So there's a fresh perspective. And that's why I'm so fascinated to hear from tonight's incredible panel. People from different backgrounds bringing yet more fresh perspectives to a world that now more than ever so desperately needs them. And moderating our panel of fresh thinkers tonight is one of Australia's finest thinkers himself, Adam Spencer. I don't know where to start. He's a polymath, commentator, comedian, DJ, podcast host, musician, author, general sports tragic. He's a women's soccer coach, and most importantly, he's a terrific all-round person. He's a great friend of Deutsche Bank, having moderated our annual forum over the past 11 years, each time using all of that intelligence, wit, guile and humour to bring a fresh perspective to it. Adam, warmest of welcomes, and over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Glenn, and thank you before that, Jen. And ladies and gentlemen, wherever you might be around Australia, around the world, welcome to this, the 12th annual Wibber Think Fest on the topic of a fresh perspective. And what a fitting topic, given the times we find ourselves in. Different times call for different measures, so we're doing it slightly differently this year, but one thing hasn't changed. We've got a top quality panel of corporate and academic heavyweights to dissect all the different aspects of the importance of taking a fresh perspective in the way you go about your work and your broader life. They are in no particular order, or in a very particular order, given the way they're sitting. We have the CEO and Managing Director of Mirvac Group, Susan Lloyd-Hurwitz. Lovely to have you here, Susan.
Thanks for having me.
From the Precision Group, Group Founder, Managing Director, Chief Executive Officer. He's also on the board of Prezi that we'll talk about a little bit later. Sean Bonneau, how are you, Sean?
Very well, thank you for having me.
And she is the Professor and Director of Education for the School of Economics at the University of New South Wales. You might have seen her recently a starring role on Q&A. Gigi Foster, how are you, Gigi?
How are you?
How was the Q&A thing?
Oh, very interesting. I was on there twice, and I was kind of surprised to be asked back, but it was very enjoyable because I felt I was the sort of purveyor of a rational view, and the other people were, willing to at least come to the table and have that conversation. All thanks to Hamish McDonald for having me on. We'll see if they invite me back again.
Well, you have all come to the table tonight. Let's get this started. You might have seen from our notes at the top of the show, the hashtag tonight is DBWIBF. Hashtag DBWIBF. Do us a favour and spread the messages that you get tonight on social. Get the conversation started. And just so that when on Twitter it says DBWIBF is trending, people will check out what's going on there. Ooh, it's a Think Fest. Let's start it right now. Let's start big by examining the economy and Australia's place in the world economy now and going forward. Susan, major corporate heavyweight yourself, you must have asked yourself this question. Where to from here? Is it time to be safe and conservative and just make sure we get through the other side, or is now there a case for Australia as an economic and political whole to be brave, to take on a fresh perspective?
I think the opportunity is to be brave and to think about a different way of conceiving Australia's wealth creation, thinking about could we turn our collective effort that we've just put into how we've dealt or are dealing and will deal with COVID into making ourselves a clean energy superpower, for example. Could we think about being the country that migrants want to go to because we can do it in a safe way to generate employment? So I would say time for big thinking.
What about in the space of retail? You have a lot of involvement in that area. Has it changed forever, or will we go back to the way things always used to be?
Well, I think I always say to you that boring retail is dead, but retail itself is not dead. And the trends we were on before are just turbocharged. Retail is about experience, brand, customer acquisition, a whole host of things that are not direct sales. That was a trend before, now it's irreversible and on the turbocharge.
Sean, you know a lot about retail. You don't know much about boring retail. What is the future of urban retail?
I think the old world retail used to have its retail shops, its warehouses, its online. The future of retail is to combine all of the three in one spot, where you have a physical and online experience which is fused and very much focusing on the customer pleasure of whether they're walking into a shop or buying something off the net. It's all about how can we make this experience more enjoyable for the consumer.
Was retail already doing that? Were you already wise to that and this has just kicked you along a bit, or is it a lesson that's really been learnt in the last few months?
I think it's been doing it in certain parts of the world, and I think Australia has been playing catch up for the last few years. But I think now everyone around the world realizes they need to operate in a very customer-focused way.
But it's difficult, isn't it? Because it's hard to be a good omni-channel retailer because you need quite different skills. And we've been working with a few digital native online brands trying to get them into physical, to do exactly that, to merge the two. And their challenges have been really eye-opening. And that, for example, they gave us feedback that said that when we first approached them as a partnership, we were really open and collaborative, and then we went into lease deal mode and we became all corporate. And that's not the world that they're from. So we're not without challenges, but that's the direction.
Well, let me ask you, Gigi, what's the secret to kickstarting the Australian economy? Because I've heard you quoted before saying that Gordon Gekko wasn't entirely wrong when he said greed is good. Is greed part of the way out here?
Greed is part of the engine of the economy in normal times.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's basically people's desire to get ahead, to make a profit for themselves, to improve themselves, that drives people's investments, that drives people's choices about whether to, opt for this new customer-centric business model or to expand in a particular direction. Those decisions are driven by a profit motive, and there's nothing wrong with that. My discipline, economics, is alone amongst the social sciences and saying there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's a good thing because it then drives the provision of more goods and services and more employment that keeps people's welfare high. And that's the thing that we've all been stricken by in this recession. When GDP falls, when we've put ourselves into this recession, we're seeing massive human welfare losses because of that, because the economy is how we generate our welfare in normal times.
But in fact, economies and individuals and businesses are more reliant on governments at this moment in time worldwide than since probably the Great Depression.
Absolutely, and one of the things I was hoping for more of in the latest budget announcement was a transition of the government's assistance, the government purse, basically, from handout programs like the JobKeeper program towards more sort of grassroots support for local private enterprise.
How would that work?
Well, one of the things that I love is a proposal by Bruce Chapman, who's at the ANU, the architect of the HEX system.
The HEX, the university funding scheme.
That said,
don't pay up front, earn it, pay it back over time.
Income contingent loans. And so he has an idea that we could basically take that model and transport it into private sector business support and potentially individual support, and then be able to support businesses in a way that is more sustainable, that encourages them to take risks. Because at the moment, they're not taking those risks. I mean, apart from my learned colleagues here, they're not taking risks on the ground because they're afraid that it's uncertain. It's a very uncertain environment.
I do like the fact, and I'm not critical, he's a brilliant man, but ever since Bruce Chapman did come up with HEX, every couple of years he does look at a different area in society and go, that could do with a HEX type loan scheme.
You know what?
Why would it work in this space?
He's a one-trick pony, but it's a great trick. The reason it would work is that it's a way to take the downside risk onto the shoulders of government and enable businesses to put their money where they think there might be an opportunity, but they're not going to be so worried that it's going to explode in their face in 12 months.
Okay, so which sort of industries or businesses are worth looking at for investment in now? Where's the growth likely to happen? Sean, do you have any read on any places that are ripe for a bit of risk taking at the moment?
Yeah, it's not about the places, it's about the mindset. The world is full of old world businesses. The challenge is to transform them into new world businesses. How do we make them more relevant to what people are expecting today? Whether that's a convenience issue or whether that's for staff. The challenge is to really reimagine how things can be. There's a plethora of opportunities. It really just takes courage to actually deconstruct old world businesses and put them back together with the ways of today.
Gigi, have you got any hot tips for us?
Well, I mean, I think that courage is lacking sometimes in a recessionary environment, and that's exactly why we need the government to be coming in and shoring up those businesses' decisions and make it a little more feasible for them to actually go out on a limb and try some of those new things, experiment a little bit across the sectors. And the government, on Bruce's modeling at least, would get most of that money back anyway. So it's not as low as though we're just paying money and never going to see it again.
One of the areas across all of industry that we're probably taking the most fresh perspective on right now is people's relationship with work, where they work, how they view an office environment, what it means to be part of a certain workforce. As Glenn noted in his introduction, it depended in some ways on how far down the path your organisation already was on the flexible work, agile work journey as to how you might have landed days or weeks or months later. Mirvac had already done a fair bit of stuff in that space and taken a sort of fresh look at selling the message, hadn't you?
Well, before COVID, we had 75% of people on flexible work arrangements.
75% anyway. Before COVID?
Before COVID.
Wow.
But it all started actually with a slightly crazy documentary that we made called Equilibrium Man. And the concept was, where is the most difficult place to do flexible, agile working in our business? Construction sites. Let's work with and make a documentary for the internet, which was not successful at all. I think about 2 people watched it. But it followed the journey of a site foreman at Harold Park, who was a yoga practitioner, and 2 young children. And it was his journey of working flexibly, the impact on his team, his family, his life, his father, who'd also worked for Mirvac 6 days a week. And it completely changed the conversation inside Mirvac that flexibility was not a separate track for working mothers. Flexibility was mainstream, and if the site foreman at Harold Park can do it, then everybody can do it.
But in the conversations you've been having with your clients, customers, etc., are different people on different parts of the journey when it comes to this sort of stuff?
I think not anymore. We've all had to. So even the people that, we were talking before about the banking sector and the complicated trading environments, even they had to work out how to do it. If you'd asked them before COVID, can we take a trading room and make it virtual? No, couldn't possibly. Turns out you can.
Sean, in your role, you do a fair bit of mentoring and leadership, and I know in your organisation's culture is a massive part of the success story. Are those things challenged by people spending significant periods of time away from work over the last few months and maybe ongoing? Is it harder to mentor when you're not seeing people face to face as often as you used to? Is it harder to bed down culture when some people might only come into the office 1 day a week?
Absolutely it is.
How do you do it?
Mentoring, or even just any relationship, is all about trust. It's about getting the deepest trust that you can with an individual. So when you only have one medium to do that over a Zoom or Teams or FaceTime meeting, it's really challenging the complete focus and communication on that channel. Whereas in a face-to-face meeting, obviously you've got many different opportunities to connect with someone.
Because Gigi, you write a lot about networks and the importance of someone's networks in the workplace or in other areas of life. You say that quality, not quantity, is the real secret to networks. Are they under threat in this new changed environment?
Yeah, no, I definitely think they are. When we speak in economics of the inputs to economic production, we talk about capital, labor, and what's often called entrepreneurship. I think that entrepreneurship component contains this idea of knowing people and knowing whom to call on if you have a new business opportunity, if you need some help, or if you want to partner with someone. And when that sort of Rolodex concept is under threat because you're not interacting with as many people at not even just work, but evening events where you happen to run into somebody, it's this informal sort of swish that we do all the time in normal times. That's not there, and that's going to particularly disadvantage people who are not established yet. Because I don't know if you remember when you were junior in trying to get a leg up in work, often it was, I happened to run into this established person at the water cooler, and she mentioned that I should do such and such, and then that leads down a rabbit hole, and you end up with a new job or some new partner or something, and that just doesn't happen sort of informally these days. You have to schedule it.
Because surely you would have so many people, in particular, also I presume lots of young women who would one day want to be bosses and CEOs of big corporations, and also give in. They'd be queued up around the block wanting to be mentored by you. How are you finding the mentoring experience during COVID?
Well, some of it is there's actually the flip side to it. I'm actually mentoring a young woman in London. That opportunity would never have come up. It would never have occurred to my friend in London to reach out to me in Sydney, Australia, and say, would you mentor this wonderful young woman in our organisation in a real estate company in London? And I think, you have to really make time. I make time every day to call 3 people who I would normally interact with around a water cooler who aren't in my schedule of meetings, and I make time to call 3 a day in the organisation.
When it comes to organisations trying to make big decisions at the moment, you've written a lot about decision paralysis and the state that individuals or organisations might find themselves in with the magnitude of the challenges that they're trying to answer at the moment. You talk about cognitive loading as a problem. Tell us a bit about cognitive loading.
Well, first of all, I'll say that the big thing going on right now for the last 6 months has been fear. And fear shuts down a lot of other processes that normally we can tap into in order to make good decisions. But cognitive load is basically the idea that there's a capacity constraint in our brains. So if we have, it's like if you're driving and you add up the number of hazards, eventually you're going to get to so many hazards that the likelihood of the accident happening is going to be really high. So if you go out and it's raining and you're tired and your kid is screaming in the back seat and you've just had a fight with your husband, you're more likely to have an accident, obviously. So, the brain can only deal with so much. And in this period, we've forced our brains to cope with so many different aspects of change to our professional lives, change to our personal lives, change often overseas and to our friends, and just the way that we live in general, even to our children's mental health. And those are really massive changes, and coping with that I think has been very, very difficult for people, and it shows up in a lot of ways. One of the ways is reduced mental health. Another way is I think sometimes some of the decisions that are made are perhaps suboptimal because people are just under so much stress, they're just trying to get through the day.
At Precision Group, you made a fairly big call fairly early on. Explain to the audience the decision you made and what you based it on.
You're saying from when?
Not to change. You chose to stay the course.
With respect to COVID.
Yeah.
I think we really took the view that we were moving into a period of complete volatility and uncertainty. And we saw businesses all around us cutting staff, cutting salaries. And we came together as a board and senior management team. And I think the initial consensus was, we'll do the same. But there was a voice inside of me which said, no, we won't. We'll not damage any of our staff with their salaries or cuts or any of the businesses that we're involved in. We will preserve as much as possible and build to the point where it became clear of what should be done. Because in that way I thought that we'd be able to adapt and pivot much quicker.
Was that a difficult decision to make at the time? Was that a tough case to sell? Because I presume that just the general inertia, the general momentum of everyone else was, this is the apocalypse, let's slash and burn and just keep a small nub of, I heard of organisations that have only kept 10, 15% of their staff and had to let everyone else go. Was it a tough case to make?
I'm often at odds with my board.
I get that impression, Sean.
But I think diversity creates the best outcomes, and I think by the end of it, we took the view of, well, let's see how things develop in the next quarter, and then we moved on to the following quarter after that, and then by that time, people actually said we made the right decision. And
Genius in hindsight.
Exactly.
Was Mirvac faced with decision paralysis for a while there?
No, I think we were able to make very swift decisions quite early on. We were one of the first Australian corporates to go to remote working. We were one of the first listed companies to remove guidance because we wanted the freedom to act like a private company and make the right long-term decisions. And that gave us that environment to make those decisions. And we had a very clear risk management procedure. We knew exactly what to do. We didn't spend any time thinking about what committees and who was going to be on what and who was making what decision. It all just happened. And then since then, we've been investing, we've been building, we've been completing buildings on time and on budget. I don't know quite how that works when you can't have your full workforce. We've been looking at new business, partnering with government. So no, I am very grateful to our board for their willingness to go with us to invest, but with the mantra that sometimes the point of maximum despair is the point of maximum opportunity.
But when you're at that point of potential maximum despair, by definition, you're acting in a volatile environment, probably on incomplete information. I read a great interview with Obama once, and apologies to our viewers, I might have mentioned this at a previous with us, but it's worth knowing. He just explained that the role of president, you have a couple of fun days as president, Super Bowl day, and you get to let a turkey go free at Thanksgiving, and apart from that, You're just making calls relentlessly that are 51-49 calls, maybe 52-48. If something's 60-40 or 70-30, it doesn't get to you. You're constantly making big decisions, incomplete information. Realistically, you will get a significant number wrong over the long enough term. How do you steel yourself to even make a decision and not just take the comfort of putting it off when you know you're in that vulnerable position?
Because it's not comforting to put it off, because no decision is worse than getting even a small majority of decisions right. So I try to take the mindset, and the senior team did, of this is an emergent situation, there is no playbook, nobody knows what to do, nobody's in a better position than we are. Let's hang on to our set of values, and we will use those as our guide to make decisions, not facts. And so once we grabbed onto that, we were able to work through the decisions that we needed to make.
When it comes, and there's been some commentary, and I don't expect commentary on individual decisions that have been made, but there's been some commentary. There seems to be an interesting, maybe a tension between governments making decisions and the private sector making decisions at the moment, either within COVID or more generally, Gigi, you've worked with both. Do private and public organisations assess risk, especially large, visible risks, in different ways?
Well, I do think that the private sector is notorious for coping with risk on a daily basis at a much higher level than the public sector, because they're, every day they're having to make these sorts of calls. Now, Obama is, of course, unusual, the president of the United States, or ex-president, but in the public sector's everyday life, somewhere in some department in the public sector, they're not having to face the kinds of risks that are being faced in the private sector. That's why the private sector draws the more hungry individuals to try to make a buck and improve themselves, and the public sector is more for stable people who don't want a lot of risk to have to manage. And so when there is a big event which is perceived to be very risky, I think people in the public sector are a little less well equipped to deal with it. And that's one of the reasons why we develop things like the pandemic plan, for example, that was famously abandoned as soon as the Imperial College London modeling came out about COVID mid-March. But that kind of plan is useful because at least it keeps people singing to a playbook when everything goes way off the rails. Whereas in the private sector, what you have is basically the approach that Susan's talking about, where they say, okay, right, we don't have really a playbook. We're gonna try to face this with our core values, and that's about it. And we're gonna make the calls that we feel are probably correct, right? And they're not beholden to this sort of prefab thing. And I think that really has shown up in the way that the different sectors have reacted to this crisis.
Sean, it's a generalisation. I'm not saying it's a hard and fast rule, but is there something in the way that different organisations go about approaching the concept of risk?
Absolutely. I think in the private sector, we have the benefit of being able to map risk from a temporal point of view.
What do you mean?
In that government and the listed market have a set of decisions often to make, which come to boards, which meet at certain times over the year, and they need to make those decisions at that time. In the private sector, you have a much greater level of flexibility of being able to bring people together at relatively short notice, or often, as I'm privileged to have in my business, the trust of a board, where they delegate authority in a much more holistic way of saying, well, you know what, we do not need to make this call today, but we will leave you to make that call when it's actually the right time.
Susan?
Well, I may add a different perspective to that
Love
question.
It.
And
Fresh perspective, go for it.
What I've observed in this period is something I've never ever seen before, and that's a genuine seeking of knowledge and collaboration between the private sector and the public sector, with the most senior level of policymakers in state governments calling out to the private sector, say, come sit with us, here's what we're thinking about, where are the holes, what can't we see, what's the impact of that? And that seems to me a much better way to combine the skill sets. And they don't listen to everything that we say, and we recommend things that they don't do, but even to have the dialogue with people creating policy and asking the questions of the people who live in that policy, I just think that's a much better way to run a country.
And even seeing a degree of collaboration between state and federal government around that newly formed national cabinet. Do you think is that going to be the fresh way that decision making goes forward in Australia, or once we're through this bubble, do we go back to the good old fashioned of you guys over there, us over here, staring at each other?
I really hope it stays. I don't have my crystal ball with me today, but with all my heart, I hope so.
Our hashtag is DBWIBF, hashtag DBWIBF. Get these fantastic conversations and thought pieces out there for people to consume. I want to look at education as a topic. I know it's close to your heart, but both generally, if people want to take a fresh perspective in their working life, education's a big part of it. And there are a few sectors that have been as radically and interestingly sort of tipped on their head. Just give us a quick rundown. What's it been like being inside the university sector over the last 6 months? A rough ride?
Most interesting time during my career, for sure. I mean, mid-March, we started shutting things down. We started going online. We had people going to their homes. We were, bleeding headsets and, Zoom invitations and getting all sorts of, different software, licensed and trying to push out knowledge. We completely refabricated the IT support method and sort of model, so that now we have these one-on-one sorts of, very informal, non-shiny brass knob things, whereas previously it was, the IT people are much more of a arm's length kind of, department. So that's all been very different, and obviously the student experience has been radically altered. So we're staying with online now. We're staying with online lectures, at least going into term one.
Weren't a lot of students already doing a significant amount of their study online? And what the rule, the cliche I'd heard was you could walk into empty lecture halls these days, or these days if you weren't posting the lecture notes before the lectures, the students were complaining, when it used to be something you might use to catch up or revise. But hadn't the system already fundamentally changed?
Well, to a certain extent, of course, you're right. We used to bemoan the lack of lecture attendance. Of course, when I was a kid, we always went to lecture. I didn't miss it unless I was giving birth, but basically, yes, you're right. It was going in that direction already. But I think now it's going to be even worse for those students who may know that they need some structure, but they can't get as much structure as they had previously. They can't come to the university and get the social support and the encouragement and all the signals that say you need to be working, you need to be engaged. If it's possible for somebody to just stay at home on his bed in his pajamas and click into a Zoom webinar, he's not necessarily going to be as well educated as he otherwise would have, and I think that's what we're worried about because of the lack of that social engagement. We are social animals, right? When we learn through emotional connection. We learn through sharing of personal things that are heartfelt. We learn typically throughout the ages in person. And I think disrupting that is going to have some potentially negative effects, potentially mainly affecting people at the lower end of the motivation distribution, of the ability distribution, and everything else. Now, countering that, of course, in a recession, everybody goes back to school because nobody wants to be entering the job market in a recession. So we have seen increases in enrollment numbers for many of the programs that we've been offering, and we're actually starting to offer new ones that cater to this demand that we're anticipating of people to come back just for a short period, maybe 6 months to a year, and get some sort of a short course training, special diploma or grad cert or a master's even. And that, I think, is an area of growth for the sector. That
area of upskilling and micro credentials, etc., is something that some people say will be quite a sort of hot patch in tertiary education.
I don't know about micro-credentials. I think I'm a little dubious about it because I think what people want is a parchment with the university's name on it. I think that's what really sells to employers. But certainly, shorter courses like in economics now, we have the Master of Applied Economics that we're launching next year, and I think that's going to be very appealing to people who just want a bit of a leg up. They may not have studied much economics, but they see the usefulness of it, and in a year you can finish that degree potentially, and then go and maybe get some more money, and maybe it won't be as bad economically at the time you enter the market.
A lot of people watching would know that there's recently been a recalibration of the fee structure at universities in an attempt to influence student preferences and create a more job-ready student market. An arts degree is now doubled in cost. A 4-year arts degree just under $60,000 now. Economics and law costs have gone up. Agriculture and maths, yeah baby, have reduced by over 60%. Nursing, engineering and science are also reduced. Sean, does the university sector currently produce job-ready people, or do we need to look freshly at the way we educate and who we churn out?
Yeah. I think one thing which we often look for with people who are job ready is, have you had a part-time job while studying? Because it's also the level of stimulus that the person is actually having whilst learning. And that combinatory effect of the practical with the theoretical. That's actually what gives people an edge in terms of coming out into the job market. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a high-powered, uni job. It can actually just be working as some sort of clerk or in some sort of administrative position. But it gives people that practical know-how of what's likely to be expected of them when they do come out of university.
I was reading a fascinating biography on one of our speakers, I'm looking at you, Susan, about a critical time in your life in 1989 when you had, quote, just finished your honours thesis at the University of Sydney, which looked at the dual identities of Icelandic migrants in Australia. So at that pivotal point in 1989, when you probably knew as much about the dual identities of Icelandic migrants in Australia as anyone going around, did you think, I'm so close to being the CEO of a major... Did you feel job ready in 1989?
I actually thought, I need a job. I'm not trained for anything, but I can think, I can write, I can research. And I called my supervisor, and in one of those sliding door moments in your life, he'd just been approached for a job for a researcher in the real estate industry, didn't know a thing about it, wasn't trained in it, went and got the job, and a lot of years later, I won't say how many, I'm still in the real estate sector. So in some ways it did make me job ready, because that curiosity as a young person, I love university programs that give people that great breadth of curiosity and exploring things without being funneled into a vocational or very narrow discipline very early.
Because on the whole topic of fresh perspective, I mean, there are some people arguing now's as good a time as ever for some people to consider a complete career change, just go with the moment and go somewhere completely new. It's also potentially quite risky, and some would argue if you've got a solid job at the moment, hold on to it for dear life. Is now the time for people to be asking deep questions of themselves about big career changes?
I think it's time for people are reflecting. When we've been scanning our customers through this, there is definitely a deep sense of what is my life for? What have I been doing with my time? Am I connected with my community? That people are asking those questions, and it's surely a very personal thing. If you have the desire and the means and the financial stability to make a change, well, why not? But if you might struggle to pay the mortgage next month, then maybe that's a different story. But people are definitely asking those questions. We had one customer say to us, what on earth have I been doing with my life up until now?
That's interesting. Sean, you've been known as a bit of a brave thinker, a corporate risk taker. Is now the time for people to be thinking about rolling the dice big on their careers?
I think, my dad was an oncologist, and he used to say when people are diagnosed as terminally ill and told you've only got 1 year to live or 5 years to live, that their life begins. And it's not about having 1 or 5 years left. It's about being given that gift of appreciating our time. And I think COVID is a bit like that terminal illness, that diagnosis. It's forcing us to really think very deeply about what we actually want to do, what our life means, how we actually, it's not practice anymore, it's real. And I think that's a healthy thought process for everyone to go through, not just once in their life, but several times.
Let's have a look at the concept of taking a beginner's mindset in the workplace when consulting problems. You've adopted a Harvard-based thought program that tries to encourage people to do exactly that.
Yeah, it's called Hatch. It's our innovation program, which we've been running since 2014. It was actually awarded last week AFR Boss Most Innovative Property Company in Australia for that program. It really tries to encourage people. It's not a fluffy feel-good, sit on a beanbag and poof, new idea comes. It's quite disciplined and hard-nosed around agile and lean learning and experimentation. And if you ever meet a Hatch person, they will why you to death. They will say, why that? Interesting, why that, why that, why that? Until they get to what's really going on and not what the problem superficially meant to be. And I shared this with Adam before, I've had the experience when we're working on some particular mission where everybody is a novice, right? Nobody is the expert, we're all new, so there's no hierarchy. Halfway through I'll think, I know where this one's going now, and 10 times out of 10 I'm wrong. And it really does humble you that keeping that wide open child's mind as long as possible is something you need to do.
Yeah, tell us more about that, breaking down the hierarchies of the group around the table.
Well, it's interesting, we were struggling in our engagement scores around the safe to speak score, that people didn't feel psychologically safe to speak, which was very curious because Mirvac's a very nice place and not shouty, aggressive in the least. What was it? And when we started Hatch and gave people these tools of how to question and the expectation that you would ask why 10 times before you were sure, and you would ask your boss 10 times why, they just went straight back into their day jobs and did the exact same thing. And we completely broke the safe to speak barrier. And it was a side product of the innovation program.
Tell us about build to rent, because that's a great example of something that takes a traditional model and completely flips it on its head.
So build to rent is an institutionally owned, purpose-built rental apartment tower. So think like an office, which is owned by Mirvac, except instead of office tenants, we've got residential tenants. And the customer proposition is no bond, paint the wall, hang a picture on the wall, bring a pet, stay as long as you like, on-site maintenance and community curation. And that has resonated so strongly with customers that we thought, the first one is at Sydney Olympic Park, we thought the customer base was going to be quite localised, that people they like the area, so they would rent in the area. Nope, we've got people coming from Bondi, Vaucluse, Central Coast, overseas, all over because of that customer proposition. So it's
same rent they'd take if they were just on a 6-month, 12-month lease?
Actually, they pay more in rent, and they're prepared to pay for the customer proposition. We're doing it's a great controlled experiment because in our development we've got 4 towers, and 2 of them have got traditional rentals owned by individuals renting out, and the ones in the managed and institutionally owned with that customer proposition, they attract 20% more for the same apartment.
Gigi, are economists particularly good at taking a fresh perspective?
Unfortunately, in the academy, not very much, no. One of our most famous thinkers at one stage said something like, there's nothing like the staying power of a bad idea. And it's because basically, we have these streams of what we call academic children and grandchildren. You're supervised by somebody, and then you always cite that person, and then that next person who's your student is citing you, and then on and on. And so we do have certain ideas that just have been fixed in the discipline for 60 years, and they're very difficult to dislodge, which makes it hard to think about concepts like love or power or loyalty and networks, which I like to study. It's hard to sort of convince economists that those are really very relevant to economics and should be in our little basket of things we understand.
And even some of the more radical ideas that are just economic, like there's more discussion now around universal basic incomes and things like that, and the role of government in supplying those sort of things.
Yep.
Is it challenging to even get those ideas on the table sometimes?
Occasionally, yes, and one of the problems that we have, actually, it goes back to something that Susan was talking about. Both Susan and I actually send our children overseas to the US for liberal arts education, which is the breadth education, right? So they may be majoring in something eventually, but they're taking courses across the humanities, the hard sciences, the performing arts, the languages, everything else, rather than selecting when they're 18 a particular program with a particular label of a discipline. And I think that the kinds of graduates that emerge from those sorts of programs are prepared to think and research and shift their mental paradigms when necessary throughout their careers, far better than graduates from just one narrow program. And so this whole notion of, we're going to focus on the job-ready graduates and the programs that make those graduates is quite short-sighted by the government and actually displays quite a lot of hubris.
Let me put you on the spot here, Sean. Can you give me an example of where you've been halfway through some project and just decided, yeah, hold it, let's completely spin that around and go in a different direction?
So I guess what comes to mind is in the last 5 years, we decided to invest our money and time in a business called Prezi.
Now, some people might have heard of this. What's Prezi?
Well, we've got 4.5 million Australian customers, so I think a lot of people would hopefully have heard of it. It's an e-gift card business, which basically gives the customer choice with what retailer they can choose from. So we saw the problem with our own customers that people were forgetting gift cards at home, or really just never an opportune time. With
nothing more embarrassing than going into a bottle shop with a gift card that's expired 6 months ago.
Exactly.
And begging.
So we were fortunate enough to meet a husband and wife with a similar vision, and we collaborated with a global app developer to develop Prezi.
How did you turn the idea on its head? Where was the U-turn in this?
So we started off with a sort of a strategy, a plan, and I guess we saw a wonderful opportunity in that the gift card market was very much in the old world. Gift cards had been around for 30, 40, 50 years. There were even still some retailers doing paper gift certificates. There still are in the UK. So we thought it was very much time to create that choice and convenience, and for people to remember their expiry dates, not by writing them down in their calendars, but by being reminded from an app. And as we were getting very close to its launch 4.5 years ago, I remember distinctly we had kept very much the additional sort of sidecar to the business of having a plastic card. And at one of those sort of sign-off meetings before you launch, we rethought and said, why are we having a plastic card? We're actually creating a new world business. We should be all in. And we were.
And in hindsight, that seems quite obvious given the nature of the product, but that was a pretty radical decision at the time.
Very much so. We thought, with all this time and money we had invested, that the business could fall flat, that changing human behaviour was a really tough call, and it's not an easy thing to do. So, but we still thought that the purist view was the right one, and we had to present a completely new approach. And looking back, it could have easily not been that, but I think in getting the business to take off, it was very important that we made that decision.
Within Mirvac, you've taken a fundamental decision too in terms of getting people to embrace work culture, but at the same time balance it with their own lives. You've taken a nice fresh look at that. Can you walk us through it? It's the My Simple Thing program. I've read about this and this sounds fascinating. Can you tell me more about My Simple Thing?
So My Simple Thing is literally the most simple program you've ever heard of. And it is team-based where everybody is allowed to, and in fact encouraged to, find one thing that will make their working life per week a lot better. And there are two important parts to that. One, it is public. That takes away the sneaking away and she always leaves to go to the school pickup, and that's not fair because it takes that away because, one, it's public. Everybody has one, and there is zero judgment. Doesn't matter. There's not a list of prescribed things that you can have as your simple. You could be writing a book. You could be taking your dad to chemo. You could be coaching a soccer team at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and everybody has one. And it's perfectly normal. If somebody said at Mirvac, I'm off to yoga now, and it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, nobody would make a joke, raise an eyebrow, make a sarcastic comment.
Because that's what they've publicly declared is an important part of them.
And their leaders do it, and I do it. Mm-hmm. And it is expected, and the way we work, with the fundamental belief that work is what you do, not where you are. Our lives now are so entwined. There's no industrial revolution concept of go to work, go home. The whole thing is blended all 24 hours, and hasn't COVID just shone a light on that blend of living at work effectively? And it is very powerful, and it's tiny in the scheme of things. It's an hour or two a week, and the effect it's had on people is just extraordinary. You
don't have to name names, but any pushback when you try and bring in a program like that? Some people who say, I've got too much, or I love my work too much, and just let me keep going?
Yes, I can tell this story. It's not speaking out of school. We brought on board a head of stakeholder relations, and he'd been used to a political world where the second shift starts at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and quite a different pace. And so I said, what's your simple thing? And he nodded at me. And a month later I said, well, can you tell me now what your simple thing is? And he said, I thought you were joking. Sorry. And I said, well, if you don't do it, how is your team going to do it? They will take the social cue from you that the words say you can do it, but really you can't. So now he does.
What's your simple thing?
I do Pilates twice a week at really odd hours. So not at lunchtime, not before work, but like 10 or 2. And I do it very loudly, and I leave with my bag and say I'm off to Pilates.
What's the message that's sending?
Hopefully,
I mean, surely the CEO could be excused for being a little bit too busy to take a couple of hours off.
I think if you're too busy to take a couple of hours for your mental well-being, you're not doing the right job. And if I didn't live that way, if I didn't really believe in my heart, which I do, that work is what you do, not where you are, and that I have a responsibility to myself on the put your own oxygen mask on first so I can help everybody else. If I didn't do that, it would all be just lip service and corporate spin, and people would see through it in a heartbeat.
So as an economist, how do you analyse a program like My Simple Thing?
Look, I love this. I love this idea for two reasons. First of all, it is actually directly prioritizing mental health, which we know is something at an individual level that's so important to continuing your productivity and your creativity and your happiness and your satisfaction at work. So it's actually promoting, what we want for the economy. But also it's elevating this notion and making visible the fact that people do have things that they have to do outside work. So if you're taking your dad to chemo or picking up a kid from school, traditionally, certainly, from the 80s onwards, it's been more difficult to make those sorts of arguments to your boss, saying, I'm sorry, I have to leave a little early, and there's definitely a shame associated with that. But the reality is that we all have a lot of unpaid labor that we have to do, and it's basically unseen. And of course, it does fall more on the shoulders of women than men, but it is on both shoulders. And so the fact that you can actually say, look, this is something important, it's happening during traditional work hours, I really want to prioritize this, is basically granting permission to people to say, yeah, you know what, I've got some unpaid obligations, and this is something that I prioritize, and it makes me a human being. It doesn't make me an exception.
Sean, in your workplace, if there was a program like this, what would be your proudly spoken about, I do this outside of work and it keeps me fresh and it's a big part of who I am and it makes me a better, more rounded person to then be able to go and do the high profile corporate work? What would be on your My Simple Thing agenda?
Look, I think we try to engender a very sort of flexible approach. So I think we very much of that My Simple Things and embrace that it's the whole person we're hiring. So it's whether it is going to the gym or whether it is dealing with family or friends. I like the concept of having to leave loudly, but it's also creating that comfort with people that they just can live their lives.
Would you be nicking off to do a little bit of music practice? Because you're actually, not everyone watching this would know, in a band.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about the band.
The Standard Deviants, yes.
The Standard Deviants. If that's not the best name for a band from someone who studies behavioural economics and statistical analysis, the Standard Deviants. Tell us more.
Thank you very much. Well, when I first came to UNSW, to the School of Economics, I got together with my colleague Alberto Mota, who is a guitarist, and I sing and play keyboard, and I said, look, I'm itching for something to do during the school Christmas party rather than spending 4 hours of small talk with my colleagues. And so, we sort of started, we found somebody who could do a bit of drumming, and we started having a few practice sessions. Now, I have to say, we haven't played in the band for, during COVID at all because, social distancing and everything else. But if the school decides to have a Christmas party this year, then, I will definitely do the hard yards to get us back together again.
I must admit, in terms of when I said that's the best possible name in the economic space, there is also Gary Weiss, the high-profile corporate board member, etc. He's in a band called the Asset Strippers.
Oh.
Which, given
Pretty good.
That's quite appropriate. But it is interesting, isn't it, how much we do. We've come to miss these. It's almost a trite thing to say, but that simple pleasure of the first time you play live again to a group of people.
Absolutely.
Is there going to be something is that going to resonate with you? Something you're going to appreciate with that?
Oh my gosh! And we've seen how that has happened in cities around the world when the lockdowns have been lifted. Young people go out in droves and they flock and they get massively drunk and they have all sorts of wild times because of course they've been gagging for that sort of opportunity. And I'm sure that'll be the case in Australia as well when we finally manage to get ourselves there.
Well, we've been talking today about the importance of taking a fresh perspective. So in closing, let me go down the panel and ask each of you, at the point we're at and where you see us going, what do you hope we take on? What do you hope we look at freshly? Or what's your takeaway message from this discussion about the importance of approaching it that way? I'll start with you, Susan.
I think if we make humanity the central part of it, everything that we do, whether it's in the political sphere, the personal sphere, that realisation that many people have come to, a bit like your story about the oncology diagnosis, the preciousness of time and how fragile the earth is. If we could take that away into how we deal with each other and the planet going forward, I think we would be all better off for it.
Sean, what's your thoughts on a fresh perspective?
I think we should just all pause and appreciate that we are in the luckiest country in the world. We really are. And I think we're, in a sense, everyone in Australia has a gift in that we get to potentially recover 6 months, 12 months earlier than everybody else, which means that I think we have an opportunity to plan. I think what this year's taught us is it's important to have domestically oriented plans, things which we've got to do in Australia, and then potentially things which we can take to the rest of the world. So whether it is reviewing what we do in our work lives or personally, I think it's really important to take some time. And now's, I think, the best time to do that as we approach the end of this year.
Gigi, you said that a bad idea can have a long shelf life, so finish us off with a good idea on the importance of a fresh perspective.
open all the borders in Australia, get perspective on COVID-19. It's not that dangerous to most people. Focus resources on people in aged care communities, immunocompromised people, people who really are vulnerable, and drop all the fear. Have a new government message that says we are going to be over this virus and we got to get the economy back going again. Haven't
you finished with a little zinger there? There you go. Hashtag DBWIBF. Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Gigi. And wherever you're watching around Australia, thank you so much for joining us for this very special 12th WIBF Thought Fest. I do hope the next time we do this, we'll all be in the same room together. Regardless, please stay safe until then. Have a wonderful end of 2020 and let's bring on 2021. My name's Adam Spencer. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. Bye-bye.